There was a time when radio stations had a list, not a playlist, a blacklist. And somehow, the songs that ended up on that list turned out to be some of the most important music of the decade. These are 15 band songs from the 70s that radio now says were genius. Number 15, War by Edwin Starr. War didn't start in the 70s. It was recorded by The Temptations in 1969, written by Norman Whitfield and Barrett Strong. But when Edwin Starr recorded his version in 1970, something shifted. His delivery had an urgency that the Temptations version never quite reached, and the song hit differently with the Vietnam War still claiming American lives daily. Many US radio stations found it politically uncomfortable. The timing mattered. Calling out war so bluntly at a moment when the country was split down the middle over Vietnam made certain program directors flinch. Some stations labeled it unpatriotic and quietly shelved it. It didn't matter. Starr's version hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in August 1970 and stayed there for 3 weeks. Decades later, the song was pulled again, this time briefly, after September 11, 2001, when media conglomerate Clear Channel added it to a list of songs considered too sensitive for airplay. An anti-war song, deemed too hot to handle during a time of war. The irony essentially wrote itself. Today, War is considered one of the defining protest songs of the 20th century. It's taught in music history courses, it's in the Grammy Hall of Fame, and it still gets a reaction every time it plays. Edwin Starr never had another hit quite like it, but he never needed one. War was the kind of record that defines a career regardless of everything else. Starr performed it live until the end of his life. He passed away in 2003, and the song's standing only grew with time. The fact that it was considered controversial in 1970 now seems almost impossible to explain to anyone who hears it fresh. It's a song that says, war hurts people. That's the whole argument. Apparently, in 1970, that required courage to put on the radio. Number 14, Brown Sugar by The Rolling Stones. Brown Sugar came out in 1971 as the lead single from Sticky Fingers, and it went to number 1 in both the United States and Canada. It also got banned by a significant number of radio stations for what can only be described as a full menu of controversial content packed into one song. References to slavery, explicit sex, and drug use, sometimes all in the same verse. Mick Jagger later acknowledged the song was one he would never write today. In a 2021 interview with the Wall Street Journal, he said he didn't know what possessed him to write it, calling it a product of a completely different time. Keith Richards, for his part, pushed back on editing it or pulling it. He argued that the discomfort was the point. The Stones actually retired the song from their live sets in 2021, more than 50 years after its release. But in the 1970s, it was still a massive hit, bans or not. Radio couldn't resist it. The ones that did ban it only ended up making the ones that played it sound more important. Number 13, Lola by the Kinks. Lola was released in June 1970 and banned by the BBC almost immediately, but not for the reason most people assume. The BBC had a strict internal policy against product endorsement. The song contained a reference to Coca-Cola by name, and since the BBC was a government-funded broadcaster, advertising a commercial brand on air was simply not allowed. So Ray Davies flew from the United States back to the UK, re-recorded a single line in the studio, swapping Coca-Cola for Cherry Cola, and the song was back on the air. It reached number 2 on the UK singles chart. The fact that the song was about a romantic encounter involving a transgender woman barely registered as a concern to the BBC at the time. The brand name was the problem. In 1970, that's where priorities were. Lola has since become one of the Kinks' most celebrated songs, regularly appearing on lists of the greatest rock tracks ever recorded, and its subject matter is now considered one of the more quietly progressive moments in classic rock songwriting. Ray Davies wrote a lot of great songs. He'll tell you that himself. But Lola carries a specific weight that most of the others don't. It's warm, it's funny, it treats its central relationship with complete normalcy, and it did all of that in 1970, when practically no mainstream pop song was doing anything of the kind. The BBC's concern was a brand name. History's verdict was rather different. Number 12, Walk on the Wild Side by Lou Reed.
I came from Miami, Philly.
Lou Reed released Walk on the Wild Side in 1972, and here's the thing about the BBC's relationship with it. They let it through. The BBC, which had banned everything from product endorsements to anti-war songs, allowed a track containing references to oral sex, drug use, and the lives of transgender women to play on British radio without restriction. The reason, confirmed by various accounts over the years, was simple. The BBC censors didn't understand the slang Reed was using. The sexual colloquialisms in the lyrics flew right over the heads of the review panel, and the song got cleared. In the US, the uncensored full version was effectively dropped by some affiliates, though a heavily edited version circulated on AM radio. The song peaked at number 16 on the Billboard Hot 100, Reed's biggest solo hit as a chart performer. Reed had been associated with Andy Warhol's factory scene in New York through the late 1960s, and the characters in the song, Holly, Candy, Little Joe, Jackie, Sugar Plum Fairy, were all real people from that world. Real names, real lives, condensed into a 4-minute stroll through a world most radio listeners in 1972 had never imagined. The song is now considered a landmark, a document of a New York underground culture that no longer exists in quite the same form, captured matter-of-factly by someone who lived it. Number 11, School's Out by Alice Cooper. When School's Out arrived in the summer of 1972, it immediately became the unofficial anthem of every kid counting down the days to summer break. Alice Cooper and his band had built a reputation on theatrical shock rock, but School's Out was different. It was genuinely fun, and a significant portion of the population under 18 considered it sacred. Some British radio stations banned it briefly over concerns that it encouraged rebellion and disruptive behavior in schools. Conservative American markets followed. The argument was that the song glamorized walking out, skipping class, rejecting authority. Cooper's response essentially was that yes, that was exactly what it did, and that was precisely why kids loved it. The song reached the top 10 in the UK and the US, and it returned to the charts every summer for years after its release. Decades later, it still gets played at graduation ceremonies, which is either the most perfect irony in rock history or exactly what Cooper intended all along. Cooper himself has said in interviews that School's Out was never meant to be dangerous. It was meant to be joyful. The rebellion in it is light, celebratory, the kind that 12-year-olds feel on the last day of June. Radio programmers in 1972 apparently had forgotten what that felt like. Or perhaps they just hadn't been 12-year-olds recently enough. Number 10, The Pill by Loretta Lynn. Loretta Lynn had never been a quiet songwriter, but The Pill, released in 1975, crossed a line that country radio in America was entirely unprepared to deal with. The song is about birth control. Specifically, it's written from the perspective of a woman who finally has access to oral contraception and is done being defined entirely by repeated pregnancy. Lynn had 6 children herself. She knew what she was writing about, and she wrote it plainly, without allegory or metaphor, which was exactly what country radio couldn't handle. Many stations refused to play it outright. Some added it to restricted lists. A few aired it and then immediately received enough complaints to pull it. Despite all of that, the song still reached number 70 on the Billboard Hot 100 and climbed to number 5 on the country chart. Remarkable performance for a song that half the format refused to play. The subject matter was considered radical for 1975. 2 years earlier, the Supreme Court had ruled on Roe versus Wade, and conversations about women's reproductive choices were still deeply uncomfortable in mainstream American culture, particularly in conservative country music circles. Lynn has never apologized for the song. She's talked about it in interviews as one of the most honest things she ever put on record. Country radio eventually caught up. The song was written in the early 1970s and held back for years before Lynn insisted on releasing it. Capitol Records had reservations. Her label knew it would be controversial and tried to delay the moment as long as possible. Lynn pushed anyway. She had written songs about being poor, about being cheated on, about working-class women's lives that nobody in Nashville wanted to touch. And the pill was the logical extension of all of it. Country music has since come to regard her catalog as foundational, and The Pill sits near the center of that legacy as the song that said something the format wasn't ready for, at a moment when someone had to say it. Number 9, Only Women Bleed by Alice Cooper.
Slaps you once in a while and you live in love.
Alice Cooper appears on this list twice, which says something about where the 1970s stood on the question of artistic context. Only Women Bleed was released in 1975 as a single from the album Welcome to My Nightmare, and it was banned or restricted by several American radio stations. The reasoning? The title. Some program directors banned the song without listening to it, just based on the title alone, assuming it was either gratuitously violent or making light of something that shouldn't be joked about. The actual song is a slow, earnest ballad about domestic abuse, written from the perspective of a woman trapped in an abusive relationship. Co-written by Cooper and Dick Wagner, it's one of the most emotionally direct things Cooper ever recorded. Once stations, and listeners, actually heard the full song, reactions shifted. Women's advocacy groups praised it for giving voice to an experience that mainstream pop barely acknowledged at the time. The single reached number 12 on the Billboard Hot 100. Cooper later said in interviews that the misreading of the title frustrated him, not because of the controversy it caused, but because it distracted from what the song was actually saying. The shock rock image had boxed him in, and this was the song that should have broken him out of it.
Only women bleed.
Number 8, Imagine by John Lennon.
Imagine all the people.
Imagine was released in October 1971, and from the moment it came out, it made religious groups deeply uncomfortable. The song asks listeners to picture a world without heaven, without religion, without countries. A vision of universal peace that some people found inspiring and others found threatening. Evangelical organizations in the United States mailed complaint letters to radio stations. South Africa's apartheid government banned it for what it called anti-religious sentiment. The BBC added it to a restricted list in 1991 during the Gulf War, deciding the song was too politically charged for general entertainment programming at a moment of active conflict. It had also appeared on Clear Channel's internal list of sensitive songs distributed to affiliates after September 11, 2001, a list that included several hundred tracks that programmers were encouraged to avoid. None of the bands lasted. The song outlasted all of them. It's become one of the most performed and recognized songs in the history of recorded music. Played at memorial services, at international sporting events, at vigils for natural disasters. The very institutions that tried to suppress it now have no choice but to acknowledge it as one of the defining artistic statements of the 20th century. Lennon recorded Imagine at his home studio at Tittenhurst Park in England in the spring of 1971. The piano he used for the recording session, a white Steinway Grand, was later purchased by George Michael, who donated it to the Beatles Story Museum in Liverpool. The song that religious groups called blasphemous is now displayed in a museum dedicated to the 4 young men from Liverpool who changed music. That journey from blacklist to museum piece is, in its own quiet way, the whole story of what happens when institutions try to silence art they don't understand. Number 7, God Save the Queen by Sex Pistols.
God save the Queen.
The Sex Pistols released God Save the Queen in May 1977, timed deliberately to coincide with Queen Elizabeth II's Silver Jubilee celebrations. It was banned by the BBC and refused by the major retail chains in Britain. Woolworths and W.H. Smith declined to stock it. The independent television network ITV refused to play it. Despite all of that, or more accurately, because of all of it, the single sold in enormous quantities through mail order and independent record shops. It reached number 2 on the UK charts during Jubilee Week, with many in the music industry believing it had actually outsold the number 1 single, but was kept off the top spot for political reasons. That allegation has never been fully resolved. The song's real significance was less about the Jubilee and more about what it represented. A direct confrontation between a working class that felt left behind and an establishment that expected deference. The BBC calling it gross bad taste only confirmed everything the Pistols were arguing. It became the definitive punk anthem of the decade. Number 6, Radio Radio by Elvis Costello and the Attractions. In November 1978, Elvis Costello and the Attractions appeared on Saturday Night Live. They were supposed to play Less Than Zero. They started it, stopped after a few bars, and launched into Radio Radio instead, a song that was a direct, biting attack on the commercial radio industry and its control over what the public was allowed to hear. NBC was not pleased. Costello was effectively not invited back to the show for 12 years. The song itself had already been banned from British radio, specifically by the BBC, for its pointed criticism of the broadcasting establishment. A song about radio censorship, banned from radio. That's not irony, that's almost performance art. Radio Radio wasn't a massive chart hit, but it became a statement, the kind of song that musicians talked about and music critics remembered. By the 1990s, it was being held up as a key document of the late 70s punk and new wave moment, when artists were actively interrogating the machinery of the music industry itself. The SNL moment became legendary precisely because it was unrepeatable. Costello had been told before the performance not to play Radio Radio. He played it anyway. The cameras were rolling. There was no way to unsee it, and no way to pretend it hadn't happened. When Costello finally returned to Saturday Night Live in 1989, 12 years later, he opened with Radio Radio again. The audience gave him a standing ovation. Number 5, Tonight's the Night, Gonna Be All Right by Rod Stewart.
Stay away from my window.
Rod Stewart was not generally thought of as a rebel in 1976. He was a mainstream rock star with a fondness for tartan trousers and a voice that got played at every dinner party in Britain. which is what made the banning of Tonight's the Night slightly absurd. The song, from the album A Night on the Town, was banned by the BBC and removed from several American radio station playlists, including RKO affiliates, because of its lyrical content. It depicted a seduction scene with enough directness that some stations simply couldn't clear it for daytime play. Stewart's then-girlfriend, actress Britt Eklund, contributed a whispered French-spoken outro that certain stations found equally problematic. Some just edited it out, others dropped the song entirely. What the radio industry couldn't do was stop it from becoming a colossal hit. Tonight's the Night topped the Billboard Hot 100 for 8 consecutive weeks, making it the longest-running #1 of 1976. It was the best-selling single in the United States that year. The bands, as was becoming a pattern by the mid-70s, functioned more as advertising than censorship. Number 4, Love to Love You Baby by Donna Summer. Donna Summer and producer Giorgio Moroder recorded the extended version of Love to Love You Baby in 1975, and it ran for 17 minutes. The BBC heard it and immediately placed it on a banned list. The grounds were the extended moaning and sighing that ran through the track, sounds that left little to the imagination. Casablanca Records put out a shorter single edit, and that version went to #2 on the Billboard Hot 100 while staying on the chart for 18 weeks. The BBC's ban applied specifically to the long version, which mostly circulated in clubs and on FM underground stations, exactly where disco was building its real audience. Donna Summer was asked repeatedly in interviews about what exactly happened in the studio during the recording. Her response to The Guardian was characteristically dry. "Everyone's asking, were you alone in the studio?" "Yes, I was alone in the studio." "Did you touch yourself?" "Yes, well, actually, I had my hand on my knee." The song effectively launched the extended disco single as a commercial format, influencing how dance music would be packaged and sold for the next 2 decades. The BBC eventually acknowledged the long version exists. The clubs had known that for years. Number 3, Short People by Randy Newman.
Short people got no reason.
Randy Newman released Short People in 1977 as a single from the album Little Criminals, and a non-trivial portion of the American listening public missed the joke entirely. The song is a piece of sharp, deadpan satire. Newman was not actually arguing that short people had no reason to live. He was writing a caricature of prejudice to expose how absurd it is. Some people heard the literal content and reacted accordingly. Radio stations in several American states received complaints. A few pulled it. The state legislature of Maryland actually introduced a bill, which did not pass, to ban the song from the airwaves. Newman later donated royalties to organizations that supported people with dwarfism as a gesture of goodwill. Despite the controversy, or again partly because of it, Short People went to #2 on the Billboard Hot 100. Newman was nominated for a Grammy. The song's satire is now discussed in journalism schools and media studies programs as an example of irony being misread on a cultural scale. Newman has said in interviews that he expected people to get the joke. He was wrong, and apparently fine with that. There's something very Randy Newman about the whole episode. A man who spent his career writing songs from the perspective of unreliable, flawed, and often reprehensible narrators, surprised that some people took the narrator at face value. His body of work is full of moments like this. The song isn't what it seems, and the discomfort of not quite knowing whether to laugh is part of what makes it interesting. Short People just happen to be the most public instance of that misunderstanding, at stadium scale, with a state legislature involved. #2, Walk This Way by Aerosmith. Walk This Way was first released on Aerosmith's 1975 album Toys in the Attic, and then released as a single in 1977. Several American radio stations restricted it for its suggestive lyrical content. The song tells the story of a teenage sexual encounter with enough vernacular detail that conservative program directors weren't comfortable airing it in full during daytime slots. The irony of what came next is almost too good. In 1986, Run DMC covered Walk This Way and collaborated with Aerosmith on a version that became one of the most important records in the history of rap and rock crossover music. The song that had been too edgy for some 1970s radio stations became the vehicle for dismantling the wall between two genres and introducing hip-hop to an entirely new demographic. That 1986 version is now considered a landmark recording. It helped bring Aerosmith back from a career low point, it put Run DMC on mainstream radio, and it changed the trajectory of American popular music in ways that nobody had planned. All of that traces back to a song that certain stations in 1977 considered too much for their audience. Number 1, Je t'aime, moi non plus, by Serge Gainsbourg and Jane Birkin. Strictly speaking, Je t'aime, moi non plus was originally recorded in 1967, but with a different singer. Gainsbourg wrote the song and recorded it first with Brigitte Bardot. When Bardot's husband discovered the recording, the release was halted and the tapes were shelved. Gainsbourg eventually re-recorded it with Jane Birkin and released the Birkin version in 1969. But the song's full run of bands, its chart climb, and its broader cultural impact unfolded throughout the early 1970s, making it one of the defining band records of the era. Radio stations across the UK, much of Europe, and Brazil refused to air it. The Vatican's newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, denounced it by name. The head of the Italian record label that released it was reportedly excommunicated. Fontana Records issued the single in Britain, watched it climb to number 2, then withdrew it from stores after it was declared obscene. Gainsbourg immediately arranged for a different label, Major Minor Records, to distribute it, and on October 4th, 1969, it hit number 1 in the UK. It was the first band record to reach the top of the British charts. When Birkin later recalled Gainsbourg's reaction to the Vatican's condemnation, she said he referred to the Pope as our greatest PR man. The song has sold over 4 million copies worldwide. Today it's considered a foundational text in the history of European pop, a defining moment in the public negotiation between artistic expression and institutional censorship. It's studied, sampled, and cited regularly. What the Vatican and the BBC tried to suppress became, eventually, permanent. Looking back at all of these songs now, the thing that stands out isn't really the bands. It's the reasons behind them. Fear of an honest lyric, discomfort with a subject that didn't belong in polite company, a brand name, a title that someone misread, an anti-war message that made the wrong people nervous. None of it worked. Every single one of these songs survived whatever was thrown at it, and most of them outlasted the institutions that tried to silence them. The decade that produced all of this, the 1970s, is now remembered as one of the richest periods in recorded music history. Which makes sense. The artists who were willing to push hard enough to get banned were often the same ones who were pushing hard enough to make something that would last. If you want more videos like this, music history, the stories behind the songs you grew up with, hit that like button and subscribe. There's a lot more worth remembering.